right. Welcome back, and thank you all here in person for coming back, and for you online for joining. I'm really pleased and honored to be sitting here with three distinguished panelists for our first conversation this morning, where we're going to be talking about redefining and closing the digital divide. And with me here is Clayton Banks, the CEO and founder of Silicon Harlem, Kate Wittels, a partner at HR&A, a consulting firm who leads the digital practice there, and Noel Hidalgo, who is the executive director of BetaNYC and a pillar of New York City's civic tech community. So thank you all so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. And all three of them have been really helpful and given us great thoughts and insight that have been incorporated into the report thus far. But to start off talking about the digital divide, let me turn to you, Clayton. You started Silicon Harlem because you saw a digital divide emerging, and you did this long before it was a common term. Today, digital divide is like on everybody's lips, but it's only a couple of years ago it was kind of a new concept. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about what brought the digital divide to your attention, how did you understand it when you started Silicon Harlem, and how have you seen it evolve in your time thus far?
Well, thank you, Rohit. Yes, my name is Clayton Banks, CEO of Silicon Harlem. I'm wondering why you all are here. I love it, though. I mean, because this is my favorite subject to talk about connecting people. That's really what this comes from when it comes to Silicon Harlem and Clayton Banks. And I want to thank SCNY and Rohit and the whole team that's invited this voice to this particular event. And I have to say, my cohorts are awesome. Kate, actually, I have to give her a bunch of accolades because my senior project manager, Claire Young, is a master's out of her urban planning, and she was her professor. So I benefit from that, and Noel and I go way back. And so it's a great honor to be here. Thank you very much. In 2014, I was very much obsessed with technology and how do we make it a little bit more accessible for so many people, because I've been very fortunate in my life to have that kind of access and exposure. I know what that feels like. And my first home I bought years and years ago was in Harlem. So back in the early days in the 90s in Harlem, we were very well known as today about culture and food and music and great things, but I didn't see the kind of technology movement that needed to happen in that area. So one of the first things I wanted to do was just figure out, well, what is happening? And in my research back in 13, 14, 40% of people had no internet in the home. 2013, 14, I was on this. You hear about it now, but I'm talking about years ago, and Noel knows, I was banging on every door I could to say, hey, do you know what's happening here? Because there were other parts of New York City where, 90 to 100% of people had internet. And so I thought, well, boy, oh boy, this is not just, my pet peeve. This is also a city issue. It has to be addressed. And so over the years, I was banging on the mayor, banging on, our CTOs, bringing this to as much as I possibly could to the fore. And you would get a little like, oh, really, Clayton? Oh, is that right? And then all of a sudden, it took a pandemic for people to go, what were you talking about, Clayton? Those people were dying. And you know where they were dying the most? In Upper Manhattan. Why? They didn't have the internet. I'm not saying that's the only reason, but I'm saying that there was many people couldn't get to the hospital. So your question is an excellent one. Why I got into it is because I knew years ago this was a must-have, not a nice-have. It's a must-have. And I'm one of those people who's been around long enough that I worked for a company called Sega Channel. If anybody loves video games like me, it was a dream job. But the most important part of it was we embraced the internet in 1994 and really figured out streaming, and we really saw then what the future looked like. So I've been on this for some time, and all I want to see is to make sure everyone has a connection. It's not a nice thing anymore. It's a must thing anymore. So that's the whole reason why I do what I do.
Excellent. Thanks, Clayton. And we're going to come
Can
back.
I leave now? Is everybody good?
No, not enough, not enough. There's more. And we're going to come back to some of that. I want to skip over, though, and go to you, Noel. And, BetaNYC has been a leader both in getting local government to use technology and ensuring that New Yorkers of all walks of life can use it. How do you see the digital divide?
Well, I think the expression of the digital divide was best stated either yesterday on Chelsea Meldon's panel with a beautiful lineup of really intelligent individuals talking about technology. We're talking about communities. Community is not a monolithic, it's a series of communities, and every single community has its own set of injustices and discrimination that it has experienced. There's some people who definitely have been more privileged inside of the society, and through that, there are multiple digital divides. And the digital divide is really a manifestation of all of the inequities that various communities have been going through. And so the challenge right now is to figure out what communities have gotten accustomed to what technology, and then figure out how to bridge that to a common platform. Hopefully that common platform is government services that have been properly user tested and are accessible to everybody. But right now, there's not a monolithic digital divide. There are thousands of digital divides across every single generation, across every single education like level of education attainment. And even within wealthy communities, it took me 6 years to get FiOS because my block was essentially somebody was preventing Verizon from bringing fiber from the front of my apartment to the back of my apartment. And so, that digital divide is every other block all had FiOS. Our block didn't. So, finding all of those little niche crevices that we need to transcend is the challenge of crossing the digital divide.
So that's interesting, and you're saying that that there are lots of check marks for what would constitute not having full access, and you're pointing out that really from a government perspective, one of the things is to meet people where they are.
Absolutely.
Right, and so it's kind of like an API function that government has to play, not a prescriptive function. It's
beyond an API. I mean, there's some really great services that are being produced as APIs. I see Matt over there, NYC Opportunity does a fascinating and miraculous job to build platforms that are accessibly through APIs, but then they do the next step, which is actually user testing the interface depending upon the method that community accesses those services, right? So it's not just building a platform and the expectation that the market will meet the needs based upon the API. It's about taking that extra step and making sure that the most vulnerable individuals that are accessing those services actually have a voice to make sure that they have access to those services.
All right, that's fascinating. Thank you. Well, let's come back to some of that definitional stuff. But Kate, let me ask you. You've got both here in New York and a number of other cities you've done work for around technology. How do you see the digital divide? Does it conform with what Clayton and Noel have said? And how do other cities think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really an and with what they said. So yes, access to connectivity is a first mover. It's necessary, but it needs to go beyond that. We need to think about affordability to use it. And we also need to think about how, technology has changed how we transact, how we buy things, how we travel, how we communicate, how we learn, how we do our work, everything, right? And we need to think about what does the rest of the built environment need to be, or how do we provide services and opportunities so that everyone can get access to the disruption that technology has brought us. And some of that disruption is really great and has transformed how we can actually travel more efficiently, access more resources faster, be able to have meetings virtually and in person for those who cannot come here today. And so when we talk about the digital divide, I think we need to make sure that it's both just primary connectivity, secondary affordability, And third, make sure that we have all the other infrastructure in place so everyone can benefit and use the new services and the disruption that technology has brought to improve how we live in cities.
Excellent. Thank
Can
you.
I say something?
Please.
I want to really echo that. One of the issues I think we do not talk enough seriously, which is the wealth gap in this country. In New York City, it's not a digital divide. It's a divide, as Noel talked about, the different ways a divide could be articulated. But if you really think this through, almost everywhere in New York City you can find an electronic place. You can also see that there's Fios and Spectrum with infrastructure all over the place. The question becomes, can you afford it? So I hope we get into that a little bit.
Well, you kind of anticipated my first question, because I wanted to dig into some of these aspects and get to the question around, well, what should city government do about this? And so to start with that fundamental question of broadband access. Mayor de Blasio issued an internet master plan a little less than 2 years ago, which called for the creation of a publicly owned network of conduit and fiber across the city, which would ensure competition to serve each and every building, or at least each and every corner in New York City with multiple providers. Some have said it's unnecessary. Some have said there's basically already universal access. It's not all super high speed, but basically everybody in New York is within the vicinity of fiber, and that the biggest gap right now, at least some have argued, and of course the broadband providers right now particularly argued, that the biggest gap is actually more like you described, Noel, which is not that the conduit isn't there, not that the fiber isn't there, but that the buildings, that there's something, whether it's the landlord or some owner or something, has prevented access. And so the perspective that one hears, I've heard some feedback from this on the report, is that city-owned network is unnecessary, because if your goal is universal access, we've already got universal access. What would you say to that?
I'll start.
Please.
I'll start. I think the Internet Master Plan is something that is very much still relevant, important, and we still should continue to follow. It was written by my partner, Danny Fuchs at HR&A, so I should maybe a little bit biased. But, one of the things it really talked about is competition. And while there may be access across the city and many people can access this, we're not a city where we want a singular company providing a utility, right? Like, we need to have competition to ensure improved service, to ensure affordability. That's how our economy works. And so that's primary as to why it's still important to be talking about this. Secondary, that allows for more companies to be able to become ISPs and provide. I think the city put out their first RFP and we have 11 new providers. That's great. That's competition. That will improve service. That will improve forcing of affordability. And we do know that having access will grow the city. I think we said something 10%, create an additional 150,000 jobs, can create 150 billion in personal income. Those are all meaningful things that we need to continue to push for to help to address and close the digital divide so we all can benefit from the technology we're all developing today.
So basically, you're saying that the fundamental thing is about a city investment that's a down payment now in infrastructure that produces competition and therefore higher quality and lower cost over time. So it's kind of a market intervention, but creating the kind of common carrier that we have in our roads and other things like that.
Yeah.
Water or electricity.
Yeah.
If we talk about living in a digital era, we need to make sure that we actually value the pipes that provide that digital era. And subsequently, we have let, quote unquote, the market, the abstract capitalist market, make that decision for us of who gets access to the water of the 21st century, the electricity of the 21st century. And so this is a failure of the market that needs to be corrected by the regulatory system we call government to help make sure that the boats that are sinking now actually get patched and lifted up. And it's not about all boats rising. It's about making sure that the people who are on the little dinghies and on the rafts actually have something that's going to enable them to float and to survive kind of the streams of tomorrow.
I would just add that to your point about the Internet Master Plan for New York City, I thought the first thing that I was really impressed with is that they created a table of just principles, like what the principles of make sure that this city is, fully connected. And if you get a chance, please read it. So it's a public document. And in addition to both of the things that we're talking about here, my hope in the long run is that if you hear the word of 2020 was COVID, the word of 2021's been infrastructure. If you're going to now include broadband, it's not just streets, bridges, and tunnels, right? It's now saying, oh, broadband's infrastructure too. So if that's what we all agree on, which turns out, and at least on the political side, it seems to be agreed. We just saw an infrastructure bill get approved, and broadband has billions in it. If that's the case, you got to treat it like you're treating the other infrastructure. That means it can't just be privatized. It has to have public and private together. And when we do that correctly with an Internet Master Plan, which I think many cities across this country are going to, sort of follow our lead, you find a way that you get everyone connected. The big guys, the incumbents that we talk about, the ones that you talked about that said, hey, you don't need to do this, we got all this already. Well, they're still part of the problem. I'm not trying to bash them at all. I'm saying what they're built for is what's the future, right? The future, what we're hearing so much about is smart city and data and all this stuff that's supposed to do something for us. Good. You can make money on that. You can do all this other stuff. But at the fundamental, everyone's got to be connected. And this word digital divide where we add things like, oh, well, they don't know they need curriculum or training. Really, I'd love a number of hands who had to be taught to learn the internet. You know what I mean? It's like, you just got to make it affordable so people can have it. They will go from there. So anyway, that's my...
So really, in your mind, does come down to affordability and driven by competition.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yep,
Can I
exactly what Kate said.
one quick question to all of you? One of the other discussions out there is around the definition. And if you look at, say, who's got access to relatively slow service, like 25 MIPS, you would imagine, you look at the map, and basically everybody in New York has multiple providers. But if you step that up to 100 or gigabit service, you start getting a lot of places in the city that at best only have one. What's your take on the standard that New York City should be aiming for?
Can I just ask a quick question? If you go from a speed of 50 megabytes to, let's say, 100 megabytes, and there's a cost for that. A question for anybody, engineers, anyone in here, what's the expense from going from 50 to 100 that is, why they give you this price? Does anybody know? Exactly. My man, look at that. Look what he put up. Put it up hard. 0. Essentially, it's 0, but nobody asked the question, oh, I would like to upgrade. Why does it cost more money? Yeah, anyway, I'm going to go on.
This is, so as a son of the U.S. Air Force, raised in public schools, I have been able and fortunate enough to have dial-up internet access since the early 90s. I have seen the multiplication of internet speeds just continue to go faster and faster and faster. In that perpetual conversation of what is the faster down, there's always been a undercurrent talking about what's the fast up. And while I think there's been a kind of a global consensus that we need to have fast down, something that keeps on falling off in the digital divide conversation is the fast up. The promise of me being an equal partner on the network, the ability to host my own services, the ability to be a creator and bring those things to my home, to my hands, to my family, and be able to be a part of this global network. So to answer your question specifically, I think the minimum should be, at least a gigabit down and at least a gigabit up. And it's frustrating as hell to be in this environment now where it's all about consumption, and it's all about like how fast can I download that movie, but it's not about like how fast can I interact and do the exciting things that I want to do going upstream.
And that's actually, builds on this thing and some of what we saw during the pandemic that if we had been talking about this 2 years ago, our mental model really would be, it's the streaming video on Netflix or something. Mm-hmm. Whereas now our mental model is much more participation in the Zoom classroom, mm-hmm. right? And that does require the equal up and down.
It's been done in a lot of countries. Mm-hmm. If you go to Singapore, the average speed is a gigabit up and down. Mm-hmm. They are upset if they don't have a gigabit of speed. Mm-hmm. And why? There's competition. Mm-hmm. So there's a pathway that we can do here in New York and throughout this country. It's not a engineering technology, there's no way we can do that type of thing. This is going to require our voices to demand it.
Great, thank you. Let me turn the discussion a little bit, because as I said earlier, we talked about in the report, we talked about broadening the definition. So we've talked about the broadband access, which is absolutely critical, but it's only one component. And Kate, you and I have talked about this idea that participation in the internet economy is just as important as that high-speed component. And one of the things that I felt like I really learned during the research for this is I had probably entered into it with this perception that deliveries are a luxury, right? Rich people get Amazon, rich people get DoorDash, right? And yet what we started uncovering was the relevance of those services to people of lower income who currently tend not to use them. Could you share a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the benefits that e-retail gives you, you can purchase, you realize you're running out of toilet paper at 10 o'clock at night, and you can purchase it at 10 o'clock at night, and it will be there in the morning or maybe an hour later. That is a luxury. That is a benefit that is efficient. It also saves time if you're a working parent. Realizing what you need, you can order it right then, or saving on e-groceries or meal deliveries, everything, right? We've changed the transaction of where we buy product, right? Product used to go to a store, and then a person went there, and then a person carried it home. Now, that product, we buy it online, and someone brings it to a place, to a distribution center, and then needs to bring it to our home. But our infrastructure hasn't been built to do that. It works great for single-family homes, right? You control your front door. You can control who comes in, who comes out, and how you can get that packages. In dense places like New York City with multifamily, where everyone really shares the front door to the public, but everyone has their own door within, how do you get those packages? How do you get those services and those benefits through the lobby and into your home? It works if you have a doorman. It doesn't if you don't. You have to be home. You have to figure it out. And then if you take it a step further in terms of socioeconomic, and think about, okay, there are a lot of dense multifamily buildings who do not have doormans, right? That's called NYCHA, our largest public housing complex in America, right? Those people cannot benefit from all of e-retail. They can't get their packages. There was a really interesting e-grocery study that happened before the pandemic, and I would love for it to be revisited at Farragut houses to see what was the benefit if we tried to help residents of Farragut houses use Instacart, and it was another e-retailer. And will they have time savings? Will they have economic benefit that way? And what they found is, sure, there's some time savings. There's really an adoption issue. People weren't comfortable with getting food online. This is pre-pandemic. I think those attitudes have changed. There was interface issues. People couldn't figure out which products could they get for SNAP and which products could they not Amazon, everyone has changed their interface. It's great. But one of the major issues was also they had to be home. They couldn't get their packages. They had to find a space within the ground floor of the building to deliver them because people couldn't go up to their front door. And we need to solve that. We're solving the other issues, but we need to solve just the physical interaction so we can all benefit from this new way that we're transacting and consuming products.
And is there a role that you could imagine for the city? We did not in the report get as far in our work to figure out what we thought, but what would you imagine, any of you, on this? But Kate, maybe you start.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's infrastructure. I don't know if it's lockers. I don't know if it's a different kind of postal system. I don't know if it's changing of our comfort level of security. Why can't the public, why do you have to, be chaperoned into your building in a NYCHA property? Like, why can't we change security differently? I'm not an expert in that anyway, so I don't really know all the implications there, but just there's policies and then there's infrastructure that we could build to try to solve this. And I don't think it's that hard, but I do think it's a huge barrier. It's preventing people from really benefiting from all of the ease that e-retail does provide to the consumer.
Interesting.
As a safe streets advocate, I will pull in another hat that I like to wear on Twitter a lot. While I do have the executive director of BetaNYC, my Twitter is predominantly filled with Bike NYC tweets because I think being a pedestrian and being a cyclist in New York, it's it's the user study of how the city is built for things that are other than cars or trucks. And so much of the city that we move around in is really built for an object of the 20th century, which has decimated all of our communities, whether we built freeways through them or we've lined our parks with car storage. We have designed our city for a mode of transportation that is for the few. Most New Yorkers don't own cars. And when we start thinking about how do we re-architect a city for the 21st century, we need to reclaim the curb space, whether it's to fight the sanitation issues that we're currently experiencing with rats in every single neighborhood tearing through our parks, our trash, and whether it's for finding spaces for our bicycles or for our e-bikes that are going to be replacing cars, or whether it's for the delivery of, like, essentially commerce of goods and services that are displacing the small businesses that we have been dependent upon. We really need to, when we think about building the city for the 21st century, is to, and I will say this so that way it's ensured that it's said on the third day, ban cars in New York City, so that way we can actually have an equitable 21st century city.
Are we still talking about the digital divide?
Yes, because
okay.
it's infrastructure.
No, I'm
right?
with you, brother. Let me tell you, I just wrote a whole op-ed on this issue. And part of that is the congestion pricing that the city and perhaps even the state is thinking about. We don't know how much we can take cars off the streets, but we do know they should pay. Mm-hmm. And what they can do with that is subsidize things like the great idea of having lockers at NYCHA. If you think about it, they have mailboxes. Seems to be no problem with that, so why can't we expand that into deliveries? So it's just an idea. I'm not saying that's the only thing that could be done. But I do think that that is a major issue. I'm on NYCHA properties all the time. It is definitely a challenge, and we have to do better. So I think that requires funding and good minds and all that other stuff. So why not, to your point, Noel, South Bronx and Harlem has the highest level of asthma in the country. Why? Most of you may or may not know.
Because you drive through it.
Upper Manhattan has the most bridges in all of Manhattan, and almost all of them are free. So people come in through Harlem and go right through downtown, and we get to suck up all that gross stuff. And so we have more people sick. So I've been on the same issue from maybe a different perspective, but I do think there's money that we could at least help subsidize some of these long existing disparities.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And we'll have a chance to come back to that after lunch when Sarah Goodyear is going to be leading a panel on mobility. But before, and I think we'll have a couple of minutes for questions. I'll do one more question to my colleagues up here, though. You know, we've heard a lot about the need for training. And it's actually something that we did not include in the draft report, and we've gotten the feedback that that was an omission, so we're going to try to address that in our final version. But we've actually found something in the conversations that is a little bit counterintuitive. It's not, and Noel, this builds on I think perhaps one of your observations. It's not that low-income New Yorkers are more likely to be digitally illiterate. In fact, what we're finding is that there are differences in how they use technology. There are differences in what they use it for, and there are differences in the devices that they use. And that while higher income New Yorkers and people with advanced degrees and things, of course, our image is always you're sitting at a laptop with that high-speed connection at your desk or your kitchen table or whatever. In fact, lower income New Yorkers are doing really well in being involved in the digital economy if they have a smartphone and a wireless data plan that has sufficient capacity. That's one of the things we've been hearing. So the question is, how should we think about this? Should we be thinking about the digital divide as making sure everybody has that laptop and broadband connection? Or is it more, or how do we think about kind of what a right ambition is? What's sufficient? Is it more about how many services people can access? And of course, I know, like, we're in a world in which every major company that does stuff related to the internet has moved to mobile first already, right? And so they're, like, Amazon doesn't assume anymore that the majority of their orders are taking place on a laptop. They're thinking very differently. So how should the city be thinking about that?
Thanks, Megan McDermott from the CTO's office for sending me a comprehensive research on how much money's been going into digital literacy. I want to give you a huge shout out. Thank you for all the work that you've been doing also at Mozilla's foundation prior to the CTO's office. City Council has been allocating $4.6 million to do digital inclusion and digital literacy initiatives. So that's $4.6 million pretty much for like the last 8 years. And those are hundreds of nonprofit organizations and civic groups and schools that all have to compete for that same $4.6 million bucket of money, which is really a drop when we compare about how much money is going into this broadband initiative. The broadband initiative, you know, the infrastructure bill that we just heard from Congress, is $42.45 billion that's going to end up going into infrastructure hands, essentially corporations that are going to help build out the network. How much do you think is going to be going from the federal government to build digital literacy? Anyone want to shout out a number? Shout it out. Zero. It's actually $2.75 billion, right? It's another drop in the bucket when it comes down to getting people educated to use the tools and objects connected to that network. We're fortunate enough in New York City to bake in digital literacy initiatives in the CS for All program. I really, really admire all of the work that the Department of Education has put in. It talks about civics, it talks about digital literacy, it talks about programming, it tries to build a full-rounded individual from K through 12. But then things start falling off, right? How frequently are we building in digital literacy into our normal everyday action? We were talking about mentoring people and mentoring young people into the office place. You know, how are we really baking this in so that way digital literacy is a muscle that is perpetually being flexed as older we get? BetaNYC has focused through the pandemic to ensure that community board members had the skills, tools, resources, so that way they could participate in virtual community board meetings. We made sure that we found a platform that you could dial into, and then we did all of the training, so that way Manhattan, thank you Manhattan Community Boards for joining us on this, were some of the most digitally connected and had complete communications online. But it was a big focus on training, and making sure that people had open office hours to come into the conversation to learn this new tool, and we could meet people where they were at. So my summary statement is that it's not enough money and not enough attention, even when we talk about the digital divide and building the pipes. We're not funding the literacy initiatives that we need to be funding.
Interesting. Kate?
I think to bring back the structure we had before about up speed and down speed, right? The downspeed, the consumption, mobile first is working in a lot of ways, right? You can do most, you can watch, you can purchase, you can surf, everything needs to be designed better. But the upspeed, the participation back in, we would still need to have another sort of device, another sort of better structure, right? And I think we need to think about both of those things because we need to make sure that everyone can down and up, right? Up is about if you have to work from home, if you have to learn from home, if you want to create a new business that is using broadband and technology, you want to up. And that I think we now aren't talking about as much.
That's interesting. All right. All right. So you're saying the mobile phone or the smartphone is fine to be a consumer, but you
be a
can't start a
participant.
business on a mobile phone. That's
No.
interesting.
Yeah, 2 quick case studies on my side, which weren't case studies, I just call them that now. But what happened was, when the pandemic hit, Silicon Harlem, my company, really wanted to, the mayor at some point, like in April, said, oh, by the way, we might suspend the summer youth employment program. That's a pandemic, right? A bunch of teenagers with nothing to do, no school, no jobs.
No money.
And no money. So we said, you know what? We're going to take on over 100 young people during the summer and teach them how to code. And we do that every year, but we only usually do 20. But we did 120, actually. And just a quick thing that happened was we noticed as we got various cohorts going, one cohort, there was 3 of the people who said they wanted to be in the class that were falling behind all the time. We were wondering, what is going on here? And when we finally got a hold and said, what's happening? Why are you keep falling behind? Well, we're trying to do the course on my cell phone. It doesn't work.
Yep.
So this idea that, oh, it's good enough if they have a smartphone is ridiculous. How many of you know about the metaverse? That's coming hard and fast. You know who's building it? Those who have those type of infrastructure. So they can always be great consumers. But when are we going to allow our citizens, our neighbors, and our friends to be developers, to be people that can actually create a business and really contribute to everything that we have? We're missing out on brain power in our city. There's a kid out there that could have saved my sister who died by cancer. I want every brain to the table, and it can't just be through a cell phone. I'm sorry, there's too much.
That's helpful. Thank you. Let's. We've got enough time probably for 1 or 2 questions, and we're going to have a couple of people here in person. I've got one from online, and please feel free to put them in Zoom. And so I'll start with the one that I've got from our online participants, which builds actually, Kate, I think on your question, which basically is asking us to think a little bit more about the infrastructure upgrades. So the person writes, NYCHA buildings were built for a different time to solve or not solve different problems. A rethink of infrastructure today is needed and would be very smart. What do you think we would need to do to get there?
I mean, I think there's definitely this just delivery reception issue. There is also just building operations issues that needs to change. There's also wiring and make sure that we have access there. We're not going to rebuild our public housing infrastructure, but we need to figure out how to upgrade it. And there's upgrade both in terms of investment and changes in operations. Those are 2 things that need to be addressed to make it work for us. I do think one thing about NYCHA is that the unit sizes are actually, there are decent sized units, and we need to have bigger homes now if we're going to be doing more things in our home. If we're going to be learning in our home, we're going to be working in our home, we're going to be more entertaining in our home. And that's one thing that I think could actually be beneficial about how we built it on a 20th century way.
NYCHA, of course, I mean, for all of NYCHA's challenges and problems, you have the advantage of a central administration for the 168,000 units, I think, in NYCHA, if I've got the number roughly right. But, you also pointed out that in that much bigger middle of people who don't live in single-family homes, don't live in NYCHA, and don't have a doorman is probably the majority of New Yorkers. Right? And I wonder, what would you do there, since there isn't that central administration for the brownstones in I don't know, Bed-Stuy or in Upper Manhattan?
I think we just need to have like containers out on the street.
Yeah.
There you have your micromobility container, there is your sanitation recycling container, and then there is your e-commerce and postal container that probably is easily connected to the 5G network. And so let's repurpose the street for that space, for public good.
Well, my thinking is this, like I've been, like I said, walking the public housing and affordable housing in all different parts of Harlem. And I think the voice that we need at the table is the people that live there.
Yes.
We get to sit around and be academic about this, but they will tell you exactly what needs to happen. And we got to do more of that. It's not easy to do, but we have to do more of that. To my experience, people that are on the lower side of a socioeconomic ladder are probably more savvy than anybody when it comes to know how to, find the right pricing, find the way to make it. So why not use their voice to help us solve the problem?
Interesting.
Well, that's about meeting New
it.
Yorkers where they're at, right?
Yeah.
Which is something that we're having a hard time just getting government to QA its own software for providing essential services like 311 or vaccine websites. So the challenge is great.
I did a meetup at St. Nicholas. What? Yeah, I did a meetup at St. Nicholas. I had my team go over there and survey a spot that we were going to do it, and there was a leak in the room. Water leaking in the room.
Yep.
So the guy says, the super over there said, "Oh, we'll fix it before the meetup." So, oh, great. And my team's telling me, "Let's do it in our office, please." Let's do it. Anyway, long story short, we brought the Manhattan Borough President, Gil Brewer, and who's supposed to be here soon. And the leak was still there. In fact, worse. There's bigger things to be dealt with. I mean, our kids. We had 3 kids that didn't get on our one of our cohorts for that summer. We found them and they said, "Oh, we didn't have any electricity." There's bigger things going on here, right? So if that's the kind of treatment you get, where you get no lights, you have water leaking, there's something about what we have to make a commitment to help people, not just technology. And I'm a tech guy. We got to help people.
Yes.
And infrastructure is a big part of that.
Interesting. Excellent. Do we have any questions here in person? If not, that's okay. You guys have answered every question that the in-person audience could possibly have. Oh, we do. Is that a? All right. There we go.
So just to follow up on what you were saying, getting into the tech requires to fix the infrastructure first, have lights, have heat, no leaks in the roof. So how do we address that before? How can we all as a community help you and use technology to address this kind of issues?
I'll go quickly, but as Noel said, there's never enough money, but the CEO of NYCHA has put together a dramatic plan to fix these fundamental things, and I encourage everyone to go read. It's called a blueprint. And if you look at this blueprint, he's actually addressing these exact issues and how we, as New Yorkers, can also be helpful. So I encourage everybody to look at that particular document.
And not to make this all about NYCHA, but there was a conversation that had been going on for a while that public housing is infrastructure, just as much as broadband is infrastructure. And if we start thinking about it that way, maybe we'll actually put money and dollars into investing in it.
Excellent.
My answer is making sure that government works for the digital era that we're in by saying smart people go work for government, regardless of whoever is there. I have many friends who kind of stuck through the Obama administration and through the Trump administration just to make sure that shit didn't fall apart, and are now, sailing through and really fixing the wrongs that they've seen for the last 6 to 8 years in the Biden administration. I want to call out Matt Klein again, if he's still here. Matt Klein is with NYC Opportunity. It's the Civic Service Design Studio. So if you're a designer, if you're a technologist, if you're really interested in products and you want to build products that actually hits every single New Yorker, they're hiring. So if you're thinking about wanting to fix some of these problems, go work in government. everybody's hiring. We're about to have this big administration change, not only at the city, but also at the state. And we need smart people inside of city government who are willing to slog through the bureaucracy so that way we can actually fix these problems. And then on top of that, elect really smart people. So, go door to door, campaign with them. Make sure that they understand that these issues are their issues and that they can't solve the bigger issues of justice, access, housing. You can't solve those problems without some side of technology or design practices. So, buckle up. We got to fix the future before we all get flooded out. So, thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you. That's a great way to end. We've heard that digital is about people. We've heard that it's about infrastructure, and we've got to make the infrastructure and our training meet people where they're at and meet people and meet the needs of the 21st century. I want to thank Noel, Kate, and Clayton. Thank you so much for a great inaugural conversation
Thank you, Rohit.
today.
Thank you.
And in just a couple of minutes, we're going to change out our chairs and move to our next conversation, which includes the very Matt Klein that you just cited, to talk about the digital locker and how New York City can use technology to help people get services better. Thank you.
Thank you.